Elena Senka stumbled through the front door like a wounded tide, moonlight tangled in her hair, and the scent of wolf and iron and something worse clinging to her coat. Her boot heels clicked once, sharp, accusing, before the rest of her crumpled into the shadow of the foyer. She stood there as if someone had carved a fissure through her ribs and the light would not fit. Aurora Rojas, polishing the banister with hands that shook, froze mid-stroke. The house breathed around them. Old wood settling, distant clocks arguing about the hour, a quiet so heavy it carried accusation. Elena's eyes found Aurora's and became a dark thing 2 heartbeats before she spoke. She did not speak. She leaned back against the mahogany and slid down until the floor found the hem of her coat, and the stain at the sleeve caught the light like a promise or a lie. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds, if this mystery has already captivated you, let us know where you're following this story from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected claims, broken bonds, or awakenings under the moon, subscribe and stay close. Now, back to the scene. "Don't say a word," whispered the younger maid, Luz, pressing a trembling finger to Aurora's lips so hard the varnish left a white crescent on her skin. Luz's voice was a thread pulled taut. Her eyes were wide, as if she had seen a ghost and were trying to keep it caged. For a second, Aurora thought Luz meant silence as protection, and for a second, that pressure against her mouth felt like a ward. Then she smelled it. Copper and lavender, and that undercurrent of something metallic that was not blood, she knew, and not the animal musk she'd learned to ignore. It made her hands ache with a strange recognition she couldn't explain. Elena's coat made a soft, wet sound against the floorboards as she slid the rest of the way down. Her breath was shallow, the wolf breath that had been a lullaby for the household when Aurora was younger. Safe, constant, the thing that kept the night at bay. Now it was ragged and raw. For a man who had been more gesture than presence all his life, for a woman who had been ruler and mother and storm, Elena looked small. The stain on her sleeve spread like an accusation across the chain of her cuff. Aurora's training told her to step backward, to make herself as small as the dust she smoothed away every night. Her body betrayed her, reaching instead toward the alpha as if to put a hand on the coat and be told what to do. "You should be asleep," Luz hissed again, her knuckles white on Aurora's wrist. "You should be in your rooms. Do not speak to her." She swallowed the last word as though it might conjure the thing on Elena's sleeve. Someone cleared his throat in the foyer doorway like a blade. Mateo Solis walked in as if he owned the shaft of shadow that cut the house in two. He never owned anything, and yet ages had taught him how to move through a room and make the light bend. Tall, too pale for the sensibilities of this neighborhood, with eyes black as old ink and a jaw that read like the edge of a guillotine, Mateo tilted his head as if the world's questions could be solved by the angle. He carried a small leather case at his side, one of those things the Covenant used for evidence or threats. He smelled of cold crescents and iron filings and the faint sweetness of ash. He smelled of city law and old blood. Aurora realized with a thudding in her ribs that he had been expected. "Elena." His voice slid over the foyer like polished obsidian. It did not surprise or shock. No, it ordered. "You should not come back like that." Elena's mouth opened. Nothing came out. The alpha blinked slow, one of those human vulnerabilities she kept hidden in public. Her wolf scent rose again, a soundless growl of distress that rippled through Aurora like a tide. The house leaned closer, as if it too waited for Elena to offer some explanation. The maid's finger on Aurora's lips seemed to go through layers of time, through the hour when the bargain had been struck, through the cold mornings Aurora had washed the kitchen floor of someone else's sins. "Don't speak," Luz mouthed silently, as if practicing the prayer for quiet that would keep them safe. Mateo's eyes flicked to Aurora then, an appraisal wrapped in centuries. She felt that glance like frost. He saw the human, small, earnest, necessary, and something about that made him smile the way a blade smiles before it bites. "This is not a domestic matter," he said. "Step aside." That command hung above Aurora like a scale. For 30 summers she had been trained to be unseen, the invisible seam in someone else's life. Her parents had taught her humility as armor. Their faces were etched in her mind like ghost pictures. The father who hummed an old lullaby about safe covenants. The mother who braided her hair and told her that debts had a way of outliving debtors. Aurora knew the ledger of favors that kept her where she was. She knew Elena had saved her family once, an act that had put them in ledger ink forever. The Alpha had given them shelter and a name on a list nobody was supposed to read. In return, Aurora washed floors, mended hems, and learned when to look away. But she also knew, because she had been taught in whispers, because the Enclave's elders had kept stories like coals, that Elena's pack held pacts older than the city's cobblestones. Those pacts were balance. Those pacts were law. Elena swallowed again. When she finally spoke, it was with the brittle softness of someone who had learned to answer to the moon as well as to a household. "Mateo," she said, and there was a long, quivering breath after his name, like a confession onyx dark. He inclined his head. "I came for what was taken." "What was taken?" Luz asked, voice barely a shard. The Alpha closed her eyes and let her forehead rest against her knee for a beat that felt like a goodbye. "A relic," she said, and the word was a small bell of danger. "A relic we swore to bury." Aurora's pulse threw itself against her ribs. She had been trained in the way of keys and locks, how to clean them, how to keep them from catching, but never to hold the knowledge of things that might ruin entire neighborhoods. A relic that had been buried. The word unlatched a memory she had been warned not to touch. The moonlit massacre that had come down like a story told to children to keep them obedient. A night when wolves turned on the humans who had sheltered them, and every shadow grew teeth. The elders had called that night the Reckoning. They had sworn never to speak its name. Elena Senka had been there. Aurora's parents had not been so lucky. Mateo clicked the leather case closed with a soft, precise sound. "The covenant says a breach has occurred," he said. "A relic shifted, and with it a balance. The Senka pack was implicated, and I have the authority to hold them accountable." He let the word authority fall as if it were a verdict. "We need the relic." "It's gone." Elena's voice came out like a shard of ice, not with the Alpha's iron, but with the atom of something far more private: fear. Her hands found the clasp of her coat, and tightened until a smudge of that dark stain spread. "I went to take it where we hid it. Someone had already taken it, or it was loose. I thought I could—" Her breath stopped. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, and she brushed them away with a hand that shook like dry leaves. Luz made a sound that could have been a sob or a plea. "Mistress," she began. "Don't speak." Luz's finger had gone white from the pressure. Aurora felt suddenly complicit in a silence she hadn't chosen. The house felt like a mouth full of secrets and bad pledges. Mateo's face hardened in that way immortal things do when they decide to weigh the hearts of mortals. "The covenant will impose terms if the relic is not returned," he said. "Terms that will not look kindly on reprisals. You know that, Elena. You swore the pact yourself." Elena's hands fell limp. For a moment, Aurora saw the lines around the Alpha's mouth like the map of a life spent protecting others at a cost. There was a softness around Elena when she looked at Luz, almost motherly, even in the way she refused to speak. Then, Elena's gaze found Aurora, and it became something else, a plea wrapped in exhaustion. "Aurora," she rasped, "go to the ledger. See if there is anything there." Aurora's training made her step forward, one step. Her skin prickled, aware of the gulf between her and the two of them. One, a matriarch of wolves who wore the world like a crown. The other, a vampire whose teeth had seen centuries. She wanted to tell them she would do anything. She had done anything. But her mouth felt raw with the taste of old debts. Her voice came out small, surprised by its own courage. "Mistress, if there is anything, if there is a ledger, where did they hide it?" Luz's eyes flicked to Aurora with something wildly protective. "Aurora, you cannot," she began. But Elena waved her silence away like a thin shawl. "She helped me. She knows the old promises. And if the ledger says anything, we may not be able to bear what follows." The word ledger had a gravity that swallowed the foyer. Aurora's fingers found the banister where she had been polishing, and for a breath she thought she felt the grain of the wood as if it were a heartbeat under her hand. She had cleaned the bookshelves that held ledgers for years, though she had never been allowed to touch the bound volumes kept in Elena's inner study. Those ledgers were for the family's eyes, the record keepers, and the covenant. To be asked now was to be invited into a danger that could erase everything her life had relied on. Matteo watched her with a scholar's patience and the predator's hunger of someone who had seen the world turn on its axis more times than Aurora had lived. "If the ledger ties the relic to the Senka lineage," he said, "then the covenant will—" He stopped. The word threat hovered like a storm cloud. He had not finished the sentence because the rest did not need finishing. It was understood by everyone in the light and shadow. Elena closed her eyes again, and for the first time, Aurora saw the tape of exhaustion that held the Alpha together unravel. The matriarch had always been a pillar who allowed the household to lean. Now she was something fragile and human, and Aurora felt a curious, ugly pity heat her chest, pity and the fierce smallness of someone who had always been told she must not interfere. But the night had changed rules before. Old pacts had been broken and rewritten in the fevered hours after a storm. Aurora understood that to help Elena was to step toward a precipice. To refuse was to let a slaughter of old covenants become a new kind of hunger that might consume her own people. Luz's hand tightened on her wrist, and the urgency in her eyes burned. "If you speak to Matteo before we—" she began, and in the silence that followed, everyone seemed to hold their breath for a decision that would not fit into polite hours. Aurora looked from Elena to Matteo to Luz, feeling the house tilt like a ship. Her life had been a tidy list of duties and quiet. Tonight, the list was being torn up. She took a breath that tasted of iron and lavender and the cold air that came in through the high windows. She thought of her mother's hands, of the night their enclave had been spared, of the ledger in the inner study that had never been for her eyes, until now. She met Elena's gaze, and in that exchange she felt something begin to pull at her threads, duty, fear, and an odd small seed of something else, curiosity perhaps, or the first tremor of a courage she hadn't yet named. "What is written in the ledger," she said, "I will read. I will not speak of it. But if there is a way to find this relic and return it—" Her voice faltered, then steadied. "I will help. For my people, for what your pack once did for us." Matteo's lips twitched, not quite a smile. Elena's shoulders rose and fell. Luz exhaled like someone who had been holding the ocean back with her hands. The stain on Elena's sleeve might have been a bruise, might have been blood, might have been something older and stranger. The word relic had rung the household's alarm. Outside, the city hummed with its own secret symphonies, the low grumble of the underground, the soft shout of street vendors waking early, the distant howl of wolves that never stopped hearing their names. Inside the Sanka house, the quiet rearranged itself around Aurora's decision, and somewhere between the hush and the footsteps, a covenant held its breath. Aurora followed Elena's hand like a prayer. The inner study smelled of old paper and cedar and the faint pulse of lavender from the sachets Elena kept tucked between the books. The door closed behind them with a soft click that sounded like a hinge snapping shut on the last safe thing Aurora had known. Mateo lingered in the foyer, an outline of patient disapproval. Luz hovered on the threshold, knuckles white where she clutched a dusting rag. No one else was allowed past that room. The Sanka ledger had a presence, the way a wound does, closed, scarred, and dangerous to touch. Elena moved as someone who had measured the length of every breath she took. She did not look at Aurora as she ushered her inside. Her eyes kept flicking toward the alcove where the ledger lay beneath a glass dome threaded with iron. Outside, the city hummed with its own secret symphonies, the low grumble of the underground, the soft shout of street vendors waking early, the distant howl of wolves that never stopped hearing their names. Inside the Sanka house, the quiet rearranged itself around Aurora's decision, and somewhere between the hush and the footsteps, a covenant held its breath. Aurora followed Elena's hand like a prayer. The inner study smelled of old paper and cedar, and the faint pulse of lavender from the sachets Elena kept tucked between the books. The door closed behind them with a soft click that sounded like a hinge snapping shut on the last safe thing Aurora had known. Mateo lingered in the foyer, an outline of patient disapproval. Luz hovered on the threshold, knuckles white where she clutched a dusting rag. No one else was allowed past that room. The Sanka ledger had a presence, the way a wound does, closed, scarred, and dangerous to touch. When Aurora's fingers touched the cold glass, she felt a jolt that was not entirely physical, like a cord plucked in the dark that made the bones remember their names. The ledger was small and heavy, bound in cracked leather and sealed with an old sigil that Aurora had seen embroidered on the hems of Elena's robes all her life, the crescent moon bisected by a line, the mark of a promise. "Elena!" Mateo called through the door, voice steady as a guillotine. "You cannot hide it in the house forever." "She isn't hiding," Elena said, and the want in her voice made the room tilt. "She will help. Aurora will read what she must and keep her mouth closed." Aurora lifted the dome as if it might break. The leather smelled of salt and ash, of promises made in tides and kept by teeth. She had been here before, mopping by lamplight while Elena read through the same volumes, but never to touch their pages. Her fingertips hovered, then found the seam where the book opened with a small, reluctant sigh. The ledger's handwriting was cramped and frowning, as if the author had written in a hurry and regretted every letter. Names that meant births and deaths and bartered favors traced across its pages, and in the margins were the small, neat symbols that meant covenants. Aurora's eyes snagged on one entry and slid like someone reading a wound. A name scratched down in the early dark of the ledger's life. The year a bar of the moon burned thin. There was a line next to it, an offering of sorts, and the word beside it that made the air in her lungs thrum. Blood bound. She felt Luz's presence like a hand at her back. "There are things in there we should never have to use," Luz whispered. "We keep it to remind us, not to open." But Aurora's eyes kept falling to the entry. Her stomach clenched at the thought that the ledger held not merely vows, but the record of bargains that had decided who lived and who was spared. Her family's name might be inked in that book. Her father's lullaby about safe covenants might be a line in someone else's handwriting. "Elena," she said slowly, "my parents, were they—" A sound caught in Elena's throat. The Alpha's hands were shaking now, small tremors that belonged to a woman who had never admitted fear before. Elena had saved their enclave once, had kept them from starvation and from wolves that wanted the taste of human bone. Aurora had been taught gratitude as a law, but the ledger suggested gratitude had a barcode and an expiry date. Elena pressed her palm to the page beside Aurora's, as if to steady them both. "We did what we had to," she said. "We took an oath. We put our pride into a sentence and made it hold. Your people were given protection in those years. It cost us. It costs people. That cost," her voice broke like shoreline, "was supposed to be finite." Mateo's boots clicked sharply as he stepped into the study, the leather case at his side humming like a promise. He studied the ledger with the kind of look that made everything feel under judgment. "Show me the passage," he said. He did not ask for reasons. He asked for proof. Proof was currency in his world. Elena's eyebrow lifted toward him with a rueful, exhausted humor that had the edges of shame. "You read it, Mateo. You will see." He read as if the ink were a confession. His face did not change at the mention of Aurora's family name. He had seen lists of favors and obligations in his long life that curled like snakes. But when he reached the line that named the relic, a small phrase that had been circled with a shaky hand, and the clause that followed, his jaw tightened. "The relic was bound with blood," he said, voice like an admonition. "A fail-safe. If it is moved without ceremony, if it is taken by a hand not of the pack, then the blood must be called. The ledger names who can call it." Elena's breath came short, an animal sound of regret. "We bound it in the old law," she admitted. "We chose the way we knew. We thought we could contain it." A cold panic edged into Aurora like frost seeping into her bones. She tried to imagine what kind of object could be so dangerous that an Alpha's family would bind it with clauses of blood. A relic that required a chosen caller, someone whose lineage would wake and sing the thing closed again. The thought of her own bloodline being that line, her family chosen to keep the bargain, made her skin prickle with a curious mix of dread and responsibility. All those childhood lessons about keeping quiet coiled now into a different shape. She had knowledge that made her both protector and target. "What if someone stole it?" Luz's voice was little more than a squeak. "What do we do if it changes hands?" Mateo's gaze carved through them. "If the relic is not returned and the count called, the covenant will exact recalibration," he said. "That may include seizure of assets, banishment, or worse. The city cannot allow such an imbalance. The Wolves' Pack's failure to keep it is a breach. The covenant moves with the speed of law." Elena's eyes filled with a fury that belonged to nights where mothers made choices no one else saw. "I went alone," she said, and it came out like an apology. "I thought I could move it to safety. The pack would not permit—" She stopped, and the unfinished sentence hung there like a noose. I heard something. There was a struggle. I woke with the scent of iron in my coat and the relic gone." Luz made a small animal noise of panic. "Did you fight?" she asked, hungry for any simple answer. Elena closed her hands as if to keep them from shaking. "There were other marks, tracks that were not ours. There was—" She looked at Aurora as if seeking something she had always repaid with tea and bandaged knees. "There was the whisper of old witch syllables. I think someone used old ways. Which syllables? Words from a people who had been bent until they obeyed, words that could bind and break. Those syllables had a history Aurora knew in the margin of stories, in the timbre of older women's laughter when they spoke of enchantments as if they were mischief. The idea that someone had called on such power made the house feel smaller, hemmed in by the closeness of threat. Mateo's fingers curled around the leather case as if it were a leash. "We need to trace who had motive," he said, practical and razor calm. "A thief with knowledge of old tongues suggests collusion. The relic's removal is deliberate. The Covenant will want to know whether this is a theft, an act of war, or an inside job." Elena's face crumpled in a way that made Aurora want to step forward and press her forehead against the Alpha's knee. "There are enemies," Elena said. "There are—" She stopped again, ashamed of the way the sentence unfurled. Faces swam at the edge of her memory, other pack leaders with thin smiles, a witch with eyes like coal, a brooding man who had always wanted land the Senkus kept. We have enemies, people who would like old pacts burned, people who want the ledger scales to tip. Aurora felt Mateo's eyes on her every time she drew a breath, as if he were measuring the light inside her. The knowledge that her family's survival had been bartered for a line in that ledger turned inside her with a slow, nauseous tilt. Gratitude bent into a knot of indebtedness, and indebtedness into something sharper, the sense that she might have to pay with words she wasn't sure she possessed. "Will they accuse us?" Luz whispered. "If the Covenant thinks the pack lost it deliberately, if they decide to punish?" Mateo's reply was a small, dry thing. "They will do what is necessary to rebalance. I will not pretend the Covenant is merciful. It is efficient. We must show them we are cooperating." "Cooperation means consequences," Elena said. And in that sentence was the ruin of the world the way Aurora had known it. If they ask for blood, if they demand a collar, what then? Who among us is named? Aurora felt the room narrow until it was only breath and ledger and the difference between being seen and being a ledger's footnote. She imagined a covenant room where ancient things sat in judgment and the city's balance hung like a judgment. She imagined her parents' faces in the lantern glow of their small home, counting favors instead of money. The thought of them being bargaining chips made her stomach pitch. Mateo's expression softened in a way that landed like a hand on a map. "Perhaps the ledger can be amended," he said quietly. "Perhaps there is precedent for rewriting, a recompense that is not blood. It is rare, but not unheard of. The Covenant tolerates negotiation when it suits its balance." Elena smiled, but it was a hollow thing. "The Covenant is not in the business of sentiment, Mateo. They demand absolutes. And sometimes they are swayed by the courage of the unexpected," he said, and the words felt like an offer and a threat at once. Aurora's heart kicked at that phrase, courage of the unexpected, because she had never been anything but expected. She had been the safe maid, the quiet woman who knew when to step back. Now the ledger turned her name into a possible lever. Outside, the city continued its secret rhythms, indifferent and cruel. Inside, the study was full of a complicated hush. Aurora traced a finger along the ledger's spine and felt the weight of decisions she had not made settle into her hands. She thought of her mother's voice telling stories of men who traded safe covenants for coin and came to ruin, of the way elders spoke of balance as if it were a living animal to be fed and feared. "How long do we have?" Aurora asked, needing a time frame she could imagine working with. Mateo's face became the map of a sentence measured into seconds. "The Covenant will convene within a moon cycle if the relic is not found," he said. "They may act sooner if they deem the threat immediate." A moon cycle. Aurora thought of nights threaded through with laundry lines and soup, the way her childhood changed with the silver of each lunar arc. A moon cycle was heavy with the idea of transformation, turning, changing, claws and teeth, and a heart that forgot itself. It was not much time. Elena pushed back from the desk, the effort visible in the slump of her shoulders. "There is another problem," she said. "Our records might not tell us everything. The ledger is honest as far as it goes, but the city has secrets between the seams, and the ledger only told us the Pax part." "Which means someone else could be named in parallel records," Matteo said, the thought of it like a blade. "Witches keep ledgers in their own handwriting. The old covens keep registers in cipher. The relic could have been sought by anyone who reads the margins." Luz looked at Aurora then with the raw, fierce devotion of someone whose life had been arranged around the household's needs. "Mistress wants you to hide something," she said. Her voice had a tremor now, the fear seeping through. Aurora's pulse hammered loud enough to drown out the ticking of the study's little clock. She could imagine the ledger's pages, the names branching like roots, bending toward her like a plant that wanted sunlight. To protect her people was in her blood and her bones. To do so might mean stepping out from the long shadow she had lived under and saying things that could topple houses. "What must I do?" she asked, though a part of her already knew. Words had always been the currency of the powerful. Silence had been the currency of the powerless. But tonight the ledger demanded speech, truth, lies, negotiation, and Aurora understood that the balance would not be restored by being small anymore. Elena's hand found Aurora's and closed like a pact. There was an apology in it and a gratitude, and something else, something tender and dangerous that made Aurora's throat tighten. "Read the full ledger," Elena said. "Find all names, every clause. If there is a clause naming your people as callers, tell me. Or burn it. Do what you must. But do not tell Matteo until you are certain." Matteo's eyes, catching like old coin, flicked between them. He did not argue. Instead, he folded himself into patience as if he could wait for the truth. "We leave at dawn for the Covenant," he said. "If the ledger shows a breach, we must offer evidence or plea." Aurora felt the weight of the decision settle on her like winter. The house seemed to lean in on her, the chandeliers like curious moons. She thought of her mother's hands, the way they had mended more than clothes, and of the village's hush, a line of faces who would look to her if the ledger named them. To speak was to risk everything. To remain silent might kill the very people gratitude had promised to protect. She spent the rest of the night bent over pages, the ink and the candlelight doing strange things to her throat. A dozen times she lifted her head, expecting accusation to fall like frost, expecting Matteo to knock, or Elena to change her mind, or Luz to start sobbing. Instead, there was only the ledger, the thin scratch of the pen that had once recorded vows, and the realization that being chosen in a line could mean being forced into the center of a storm. At the last page before they closed it, in a cramped entry dated long before Aurora's time, a clause coiled itself around her like a rope. In the event of loss, a lineage of humans may be called as caretakers. The wording was precise, merciless in its clarity. The caller must be of the blood named or consent given of an equal worth. A blood must be offered to rebind the relic within a covenant of safety. Aurora read the words twice because she could not believe they named the people she had known as a child. The ledger had inked her past into a future that might ask for the most terrible kinds of giving. She closed the book with a deliberate, terrified motion. Her hands smelled of old leather and of the possibility of pain. Luz watched her like someone praying. Elena's face had softened into a look of both sorrow and relief. Matteo stood in the doorway with the leather case now a dead weight at his side. The world outside ticked closer to dawn, and the sky was the color of an argument. "You know enough to be dangerous," Matteo said finally, and the words were both shield and blade. "Do not make a promise you cannot keep." Aurora's voice came out small, raw, and as steady as she could make it. "I will do what I must," she said, "but I will not be used as a ledger entry. If they ask for blood—" She swallowed. The sentence fractured. "If they ask for blood, then there will be bargaining. There will be truth. There will be someone, something, who pays with more than ink." For the first time in her life, the smallness felt like a lie. The ledger had called her forward. Now destiny, if such things could be called that, had laid its palm against her back. Outside, the city continued to hum. Inside, the weight of the covenant narrowed to a single decision. Would she speak the ledger's words at the covenant and risk everything, or hide them and hope mercy descended like rain on the unjust? Dawn came in like a thing that could not be argued with. Aurora knew the night would not protect them much longer. The house, with its old bones and newer secrets, had become a vessel of choices, and she felt the pressure of them like the pull of tides. She thought of her parents' lullaby about safe covenants, and she imagined a future where the lullaby ended in a different tone, not gratitude, but agency. She had always been invisible. Now she was not. She wrapped her hand around the ledger as if anchoring herself to something that could not move. The choice would be made in sunlight soon, and whatever came after would not leave the world the way she had found it. The air outside was turning fragile with morning. Inside the Senka house, in a room of cedar and secrets, Aurora prepared to speak and to keep silent at the same time. A paradox threaded through with the hard, aching geometry of duty, fear, and a small, stubborn courage that had been waiting all its life to be named. The first light slid across the study like a thin knife, and with it came a sound that ripped the fragile calm. A low, charged howl from the direction of the pack houses, a signal that the Senkas were not alone in their sleeplessness. It was as if the city itself had decided to bear witness. Matteo straightened, his expression sharpening into the sort of cold Aurora had seen on men who dispatched others without flinching. "We have no time," he said. "If the covenant convenes, and there is even a rumor that the relic was removed by the Senka household—" "You would throw us under the covenant's wheel," Elena broke in, the words brittle, the Alpha's authority fraying into something animal and pleading. "Matteo, you know the history between my pack and the ledger. I paid with the lives of hunters once. I paid with exile and with the soil of our land. I have given enough blood for this city to remember my name." Matteo's eyes were dark and unreadable. "Sympathy is not a defense," he said. "Cooperation is. We need to show proof of search, of effort, of intent to restore balance. If the ledger names a caller from Aurora's lineage, that complicates matters. That is why I am here, to mediate before the covenant decides to act."
Luz made a small, angry sound. "You think we'd hide something? You think our mistress would?" Her voice stopped, strangled by the image that the ledger had made of bargains and traded lives. She looked at Elena, then at Aurora, and the words were too big for her lungs to hold. "It's not about trust," Matteo said, softer, as if he might be convincing himself. "It's about precedent. The covenant moves on proof, not promises." His hand absently closed around the leather case, as if to reassure himself that law could be contained in tools. Elena's face crumpled. "You have caught us as we are weak," she said. "I came home like a fool, thinking I could fix it without the pack's counsel. I thought I could be clever, keep it safe. Instead, Her voice failed, and she laughed, a sharp, ugly thing. "I brought shame." "You brought the sheriff of the covenant to your own threshold," Matteo said, and the sentence was meant to wound. "You returned with blood on your sleeve. You will understand they will suspect that the relic was mishandled deliberately or trafficked. Either way, the ledger ties your name to accountability." "Accountability," Elena repeated. The word looked wrong coming from her. Her mouth had always been used to commands, not to please. She looked so small in that moment, no alpha, no crown, only a tired woman who had taken winter upon herself for the sake of others. Aurora felt a lurch of empathy that almost undid the steadiness she had fought to hold all night long. And then Matteo did something that fractured what little peace had been left. He opened his leather case and produced a folded piece of paper, stained along one edge with the same copper tang that had clung to Elena's sleeve. He unfolded it with surgical calm and laid it on the desk like an unblinking verdict. Aurora leaned forward without meaning to. The paper looked like a map to blame. This was found near the old merchant's quay 3 nights ago. A dockhand brought it in. He saw a figure moving strange tongues, and in the morning he found this. He tapped the stain. He brought it to the Covenant because he feared it. The dye marks match traces of the Senka family's sanctification ink. Elena's eyes went wide and raw. No. It was a small sound, an animal instinct against the impossibility of being linked so plainly. "Not impossible," Matteo corrected. "The sanctification ink is used in family rites. Only Senka hands carry the recipe, Elena. It looks like your tilt at secrecy. The Covenant will see an alpha who put her household's mark on what was stolen. They will assume you attempted to launder the relic through the city." Luz flinched as if his words struck her physically. Her mouth moved, panting, and for a quiet second, Aurora thought she might speak something that would redeem them. Instead, Luz's face shifted, and the whisper that slipped out of her was not for Elena, but for Aurora. A whisper Aurora would carry into the marrow of her bones for the rest of her life. "You were there," Luz said, and the accusation was a small stone thrown through glass. "You know how to move in places no one sees. You were the one who—" The room collapsed into a space of sudden, fierce noise. Aurora's body went cold. Her heartbeat drummed loud enough to make the ledger on the desk tremble. "What?" she managed, uselessly. She had trained herself to be the one who could be blamed and smile it away. She had never been accused of betrayal in clear, spoken light. The accusation felt like a chisel against a statue that had been her life. Luz's eyes were wild, suddenly feral with the terror of someone scrambling for an answer under pressure. "They saw a human shape," she said, "down by the quay. The docks are where the covens trade in things they can't show in daylight. The dockhand said the figure moved like a woman who keeps keys, who knows houses like they are open books. He described—" She stopped then, and the unfinished sentence shivered between them. She was not angry at Aurora for long. Her panic folded into something raw, a frightened loyalty trying to find purchase. "He mentioned hands that smelled of lavender and iron. He said the woman wore the pack's sigil as a clasp." Elena's face was a map of ruin. "Luz," she breathed. "You saw." "Matteo," Luz said, and the pleading in her voice made the old vampire's face turn. "You asked if there's motive. Look at the house. Look at how those who are owed have eyes on us. We have enemies who would like to see us fall. Maybe they were planting evidence." Matteo's gaze sharpened like a blade. He stepped toward the doorway and back again, pacing with the cagey grace of someone who had spent his life weighing lies. "Planting evidence is a strategy," he said. "So is setting up sacrificial humans to be found. The Covenant will not be fooled by sentiment. We will have to produce the relic or a collar. If you cannot do that, you must present a credible defense." Elena's hands went to her head.
the motion of a woman trying to hold a storm together. "We did not take it," she said. "I did not. I went to shelter it. Her sentence broke on the name of someone she couldn't quite say. "I trusted someone." "Who?" Matteo demanded. Elena's eyes glazed with shame. "A broker," she whispered. "An intermediary who promised discretion. Someone from the old city who said he could hold it safely in the merchant's vaults. I sent him with instructions. I should have gone myself." She began to sob then, quietly, the sound of a leader mourning not a loss of property, but the erosion of her own capacity to protect. "I thought I was clever." Aurora felt a new anger rise inside her, molten and hot. Elena's confession reframed everything, and yet did not absolve them. Trusting a broker meant a betrayal, either by the broker or by the choice itself. The ledger's ink would not care for intention.
The Covenant's law would find motive where it needed to. Aurora's throat tightened. She had a sudden vision of the Covenant's judges, their faces like marble, their hands quick to punish. "You gave it to an outsider," Matteo said slowly, and the words were an indictment. "That makes it an inside job of sorts, someone able to move a relic without the pack's usual oversight. It also opens a motive. Perhaps the broker was paid by another faction. Perhaps this is a ploy to break Senka power." Elena shook her head. Tears stained her cheeks like twin moons of hurt. "We did what we could to hide it," she said. "We tried to make sure no one would find it. I should have been more careful." "You should have told the pack," Luz said, sharp as a blade. "You should have—" "No," Elena snapped, the alpha snapping like a twig. "No, the pack would have argued and risked spilling news. I did this to protect you, to keep you safe from being dragged into Covenant politics. I did this because I thought I knew how to hold it myself." The room filled with a thudding silence that was the sound of relationships cracking on the surface. Matteo's gaze flicked between them, as if tallying who had the most to lose. "If the Covenant believes this is an intentional concealment, they will punish the pack," he said. "You have put your household at risk by acting alone, Elena." She flinched as if struck. It was an accusation wrapped in the dullest truth. She had indeed acted alone, and alone had cost them all. Aurora's chest ached at the sight. For all Elena's command, for all the times she had soothed and saved and protected, she had broken in one single human act of fear. It had changed everything. Luz's face crumpled into grief. "Mistress," she whispered, "you should have told us." Elena closed her eyes, as if the weight of their disappointment was a physical thing pressing into her skull. "I tried to spare you," she said. "I tried to spare everyone." The fracture was not loud, a howl or a violent slamming of doors, but rather a slow, devastating unspooling. Trust, once braided into the fabric of the house, slipped like wet rope through hands. Elena's choices had unlatched old debts and turned them into accusations. Matteo's presence was the cut that revealed the underlayer of rot. Aurora felt herself standing on a floor of paper that might ignite with a single careless move. "You will have to answer to the Covenant," Matteo said, his voice the cold that belongs to inevitability. "And if evidence ties the relic to you, Senka, then your household will face consequences." Elena looked at him with a hatred that surprised Aurora. It was the thin, bright edge of a woman seeing the law that judged her as something other than mercy. "Then let them see me," she said, the alpha's ferocity sparking like flint. "I am their leader. Take me in. I will bear it." Matteo's jaw tightened, but he did not move to accept the offer. He was a man trained to extract not confessions,
but leverage. There will be collateral, he said. The covenant will require guarantees, names, bloodlines. If the ledger names a caller, he turned his gaze to Aurora like a weighing scale. We will have to present that possibility. Aurora's breath caught as if the world tilted and she alone had to find footing. To be named would mean her life, her family's life, opening to a covenant that showed no tenderness. To refuse would mean hiding a ledger's truth and perhaps tempting a worse wrath. Luz reached for Aurora first, fingers like a child on a bruise. "Aurora," she whispered, urgent, "we must protect your people. We must." But Elena's hand clamped over Luz's in a motion that was suddenly possessive and maternal and furious. "No," she said, "no more sacrifices in secret. I will not let them use you as a footnote to our sins." The words struck Aurora like a blow. Elena's refusal to allow Aurora's family to be the currency of their salvation was both protection and exile. It was love tangled with guilt. Aurora's chest felt split between gratitude and the pained recognition that Elena's guilt had boundaries that did not extend to complete honesty. Mateo watched the interaction with the patience of the old predator and the cold calculation of the covenant man. "Then what is your plan, Elena?" he asked. "Because the covenant will not accept ambiguities. They will demand a remedy." She looked at him for a long time, and for the first time, Aurora saw the nakedness of the Alpha. The woman who had kept a household together through storms, now standing at the brink with only her shame for ballast. "We will search," Elena said finally, her voice thin but ringed with a decision that had neither bravado nor spectacle, only the quiet will to act. "We will go to the docks. We will question brokers. We will call old favors. If the broker who took the relic sold it to a witch or to a rival, we will find them. We will bring back the relic ourselves if we must." Mateo's lips pressed into a line that might be a small concession. "If you find it before the covenant convenes, I will advocate for leniency," he said. "But you must be swift and honest about all names involved. Concealment will only harden their resolve." Aurora felt the strings of her life tighten into a noose, and then, oddly, into a rope she might climb, if she had to. The fractures in the house had been revealed. Trust damaged, alliances questioned, loyalties tested. Elena had chosen secrecy in a moment of fear. Mateo had come as law and threat. Luz's panic had tried to bind them and instead exposed raw nerves. Now, the work of mending or of falling apart would begin in the open air of accusation and pursuit. She stood then and felt that as a leader's sonnet had been sung to her parents in a far-off room, the quiet instruction that debts lived longer than their payers. Her shoulders bore the age-old weight of humans made small in the presence of the supernatural. Aurora stepped forward with a steadiness she was not sure she owned yet. "If we go to the docks," she said, "we do it together. No one goes alone. We question the brokers, the vault keepers, the covens. We follow every whisper." Her voice surprised her by being steady and sharp. "We find the relic. And if the ledger names my people, I will not be their offering. I will be the one who bargains. I will not let them use our blood as a bridge." Mateo's gaze softened into a look that might have been respect or might have been appraisal. Elena's face shifted, the rawness replaced by a tired relief at having a plan that did not rely on self-condemnation. Luz exhaled like someone who had been waiting for permission to act. The cracks in the house were still there, yawning and dangerous. But for a few fragile seconds, the four of them gathered like sailors tightening lines before a storm. The fractures had exposed old truths, and the truth was that nothing could remain the same. Bonds had split, loyalties were tested, and the ledger's ink bled into their lives like a slow tide. Yet under the threat of covenant law and the smell of iron on the Alpha's coat, a new, tenuous alignment formed. One born of necessity, fear, and the sudden, unpredictable courage of the person whom nobody had expected to speak. Outside, beyond the reach of their narrow, urgent plans, the city turned toward morning as if nothing had happened. Inside, the Senka house rattled with secrets. And the question that hovered over them all was no longer who had taken the relic, but what price they would be willing to pay to get it back. They moved like a single small army into the dawning city. Elena in the lead with a wolf tilt that was more apology than command. Mateo close and silent as storm glass. Luz like braided wire at Elena's elbow. And Aurora walking between them with the ledger's weight pressed into her chest. The docks smelled of fish and wet rope and the city's old money. Cranes scraped like tired ribs. Men and women in market coats glanced up and then away, because superstition still taught civility when the night met the day. The key was a skin of shadow and light. It fit the business of illicit things perfectly. They found the broker under a sheet of tarpaulin by the merchant vaults, a man with the sort of eyes that had learned to bargain with ghosts. He had a Pax token in his hand like a stupid coin. His jaw moved quickly when Elena's voice, soft and steel iron, cut through the morning. He lied like someone breathing, quick, natural, practiced. "You called?" Elena asked. There was no triumph in her question, only a hunger for closure. The broker's mouth dried. Mateo stepped forward with a legal bluntness, producing the covenant seal in a movement that said courtrooms existed even in streets that stank of fish. The man flinched as if old paper could burn. It took, unsurprisingly, less force than they'd feared. The broker crumpled like wet paper when Luz pressed on the right nerves. Elena did not shout. She simply named names with the steady brutality of a woman whose mistakes had already carved her. He confessed to selling the relic to a coven in the marketplace of shadow memories, because the price had been right and fear had been better than allegiance. He apologized to no one. Aurora's hands were cold as river stones when they were led into the cavern the coven used. Lamps rimmed with herbs, symbols chalked in precise, furious loops. The witch who kept the relic had hair the color of ash and eyes that smelled of old grief. She did not look surprised to see them. She looked only tired and interested. "Coven badges," she said, tapping the relic's box with a nail that had seen too many bargains. "You bring the right kind of people." Mateo's case opened like a coffin lid. Inside was a small array of implements and a page with the covenant's writ. He did not hesitate. He offered, bluntly, the plea he had rehearsed with courtly cruelty: return or be judged. Elena bowed her head and answered with raw accountability, telling the witch everything: that she'd entrusted the broker, that she'd tried to spare her pack, that shame had been her cloak. The witch listened, and then, in a voice like a stream over stone, she asked for something else. "The relic binds by blood. It listens to the named lineage," she said. "If it is to be reclaimed without covenant wrath, a caller must make the binding anew. The ledger names you, child of the enclave, or permission by equal worth must stand." Aurora felt her lungs fold in on themselves. The room tipped. The ledger's clause, inked in old law, had become an instruction. To call would be to reveal her family to the city and become a visible bridge between human and supernatural, a life that none of her elders had chosen because it invited both reverence and ruin. Before she could answer, Elena stepped closer, the Alpha's stance no longer full of command but of giving. "Then I will surrender," Elena said, voice steady, trembling. "I will go before the covenant and confess my actions. Take from me what you must to keep her free." The witch's stare cut like flint. Elena's sacrifice was a tide, beautiful and terrible. Aurora's heart thudded with a shock of love so fierce it felt illicit. Love for a woman who had kept others safe, whose pride now broke to spare an invisible girl the cost of visibility. Matteo moved then, and Aurora watched the slow revelation of a change that could have taken him centuries. He took Elena's offered harm and swept it aside. "No," he said, and the sound had the gravity of a verdict and the softness of a hand on a bruise. "You will not be offered as the only coin." He turned to Aurora, and for the first time his eyes were not a judge's scales, but something like a harbor. "Aurora Rojas," he said, the vowels cradling her name like a small promise. "If you will offer your voice to bind the relic, I will stand with you before the covenant. I will argue for a new writ, one that rewrites the ledger's insistence that blood alone seals fate. I will risk the covenant's displeasure. I will claim public scrutiny to change law into mercy." The offer stunned her because he did not offer protection as a posture, but as a risk. To stand with a human, even to defend one, rattled the covenant's bones. To risk it for her was an admission more intimate than any whispered confession. He would bend his power toward her survival. Aurora felt tears that tasted like iron and lavender. She could have refused, could have let Elena carry the weight alone. But she had been chosen by ink and by history, and to deny the call would be to let fear write their destiny. She stepped forward, and the air around her narrowed into the place where courage lived. "I will call it," she said, voice small and steady as a maid thing, "but not alone." Her eyes found Matteo's. "Stand with me." He took her hand then, cold and startling, and the touch was not possession, but pledge. Elena watched them with something like relief breaking into tenderness, and Luz's rag slipped from numb fingers as if the simple human act of admitting love could loosen knots. The ritual was not cinematic. There were no pyres, no thunderclaps, only the hush of people who understood the gravity of vows. Aurora placed her palm upon the relic as the witch chanted the old syllables that had once propped up empires. She opened herself, her memories, the lullabies of mothers, the ledger's ink, spilling her blood in the most literal human sense, a cut as small as humility and as true as breaking an old duty. Matteo bowed his head and, in a gesture that astonished the room with its tenderness and scandal, pressed his own wrist to hers. His blood, cool, ancient, strangely sweet, touched hers, and for a shuddering second something unnameable bridged across species and stories. The relic shivered, a thing that had been a wound relaxing into a healed scar. The witch sealed the new binding with a slow nod. Elena's shoulders sagged as if some invisible chain had been unfastened. The broker was taken into custody, his fate to be decided by a covenant suddenly softened by a demonstration of unity. Afterwards, under a sky that had lost the last of its dawn, Matteo and Aurora sat on the quay's edge. Her hand still smelled of old leather and iron, his of centuries and coal. He looked at her in a way that no longer weighed judgment. "You were never meant to be invisible," he said quietly. She laughed, half wail, half relief, and rested her forehead against his. "Neither were you," she said. He kissed her then, slow and careful, like an apology and a promise braided into one act. It tasted of ash and strange sweetness, of things that had seen too much and still chose tenderness. Around them the city breathed. The covenant rearranged its ledgers. Elena accepted the covenant's scorn in public and its forgiveness in private. And Luz began, awkwardly, to stitch back the torn seams of loyalty. In the end, the redemption was not a single glorious sacrifice, but a ledger rewritten by courage and the reckless mercy of a vampire who chose to risk his standing for a human whose small voice had been the only honest thing in the room. Aurora did not become a saint. She became something rarer, visible and chosen, a keeper who had bargained for her people with words instead of blood, and with a man who had learned that law could be softened by love. The city would gossip, the covenant would grumble, enemies would slink into new shadows looking for opportunities, but for one trembling hour, on the edge of the docks with the relics safely bound and the ledger closed for now, Aurora felt what it meant to be held by someone who had the power to crush her and instead chose, with terrible tenderness, to protect her. The city had not forgiven them. It would not be so generous. But the morning after the binding felt like an ache that could be tended. Elena returned to the house with her head held differently. No longer a woman hiding scars, but one who had bared them in public and survived. She met Aurora's eyes across the breakfast table and, without a crowd of platitudes, laid a hand on the maid's, as if to claim a small, private treaty. "You kept us human," she said, voice rough with fresh honesty. Aurora found herself answering with truth instead of habit. "You kept us safe," she said. The exchange was neither absolution nor repayment. It was a mutual recognition that they had altered one another's fates. Matteo did not vanish back into Covenant shadows after the council. He stayed long enough to argue for the ledger's amendment, to press on ink-stained officials the absurdity of choosing blood over bargaining. The Covenant, shamed by a public ritual that had married species and law, softened the edges of its sentence. It did not become merciful overnight, but it was persuaded that precedent could be amended when witnesses testified to courage and to a new kind of fidelity. Matteo's standing suffered in some circles. In others, it became a kind of dangerous myth. He had chosen a human and thereby rewritten a line of law. He walked the house sometimes in the evenings, no longer only a judge, but an uneasy kin, and Aurora learned the cadence of his silences like a slow hymn. Luz found her footing in the cracks Elena had left open. She learned to ask questions out loud instead of tamping them down into panicked whispers. She began to train Aurora in things Elena never had the time to teach: how to read sigils with hands that trembled, how to recognize when a silence was dangerous and when it was sacred. Their partnership was practical and tender in the way small revolutions are, mending hems and patching old hurts, sharing the domestic rebellions of humor and cups of poor tea. Aurora's name lived now in more mouths than she could have imagined. The Enclave sent a small parcel of thanks and a headstrong cousin who wanted to learn what it meant to be a caller without the horrors the ledger once predicted. Aurora accepted the cousin and the responsibility with a resignation that felt more like choice than duty. She kept the ledger under the study's glass, not as a relic of domination, but as a reminder that bargains must be watched, tended, renegotiated. She made Matteo promise, once when the moon was a thin coin in the sky, that the book would be used to build bridges rather than to condemn. He kept that promise imperfectly and with stubborn tenderness. In the quiet hours, they would sit with the ledger open between them, rewriting clauses with careful, legal ink and messy human apologies. He read to her the Covenant's duller pages. She taught him the lullaby her father had sung, a song about safe covenants and small hands. The melody softened him in ways ink never could. On nights when the moon rose full and the city sighed with the old hunger, the Senka wolves howled with shapes not meant for the human ear, and then, softer, with a new cadence. It was not the fierce claim of old alphas, but the sound of reconciliation, of a pack that had learned to measure its power against the fragile dignity of those it protected. Elena would listen at the window, And sometimes, in private, she would place a hand above her heart and feel the echo of a debt repaid in care rather than in vanished names. Once, as winter laid a white hush over the streets, Aurora stood on the house steps with Mateo at her back. A child from the enclave, cousin in tow, pulled at her sleeve and asked, wide-eyed, whether she was brave. Aurora looked at Mateo, at the ledger safe on its shelf, at Alina's laundry flapping like defiance on the line. She felt, in the hollow beneath her ribs, a steady warmth. Brave, she said, and the word surprised her by how certain it was. She lifted a hand and lit the small lantern that hung by the doorway, the same lantern she had polished for years until it shone like the promise of a new house, and the light pooled warm and golden across the snow. Mateo's fingers found hers in the lantern's glow, neither demanding nor impatient, only present. Beyond them, the city pulsed with the complicated rhythms of power and debt, but inside the Senka house, the ledger lay closed and the house hummed with the work of living. A wolf called from the hills, long and unhurried, and the sound threaded through the cold air like forgiveness. Aurora breathed it in as if she were inhaling a beginning. The world had not been fixed, only rearranged. That was enough. She had been invisible, then inked into a covenant, then chosen by her own voice. In the dim light, with Mateo's hand warm against hers, Aurora let herself be seen, small, luminous, and utterly, terrifyingly alive.